Peter Andreas, welcome to The Dig.
Thank you for having me.
The border is more militarized than ever before, yet perhaps more Americans than ever before feel more passionately than ever that the border is dangerously insecure, and as a result, elected Donald Trump president. What's going on?
Yeah, there is this striking historical amnesia. The border is now more policed, guarded, patrolled, monitored, surveilled, regulated, probably than any time by far, but any time in America's history. The real buildup began in the early 90s and has continued rapidly ever since. But what's interesting is a large perception is that it's a chaotic, wide open, lawless land. And there certainly is a lot of lawlessness and a lot of smuggling and illicit activities across the border. But from a historical perspective, what's really new and different is actually the amount of policing that's gone on over the last couple decades. You know, Trump, you mentioned Donald Trump, the favorite rallying cry at his rallies was, build that wall.
Big, beautiful wall.
Big, beautiful wall. He was elected for many reasons, and there's, it's complicated, but it's striking that if you had to pick one thing that people chanted at his rallies, other than maybe lock her up, was build that wall. And I wouldn't even be surprised if build that wall was even a bigger chant than lock her up.
Yeah, it's really remarkable that was the kind of central chant demand of the Trump campaign, and has now, for Trump's opponents, border militarization and the wall has become one of the most salient symbols of right-wing, xenophobic, bigoted nationalism. Yet, in a sense, the wall, to a certain extent, is already built. There are hundreds of miles of fencing, and it was border militarization and fencing and walls was a pretty accepted part of bipartisan immigration border policy for the last few decades.
Well, what's interesting is you said fencing is walls, accepted policy across the political divide, but in some ways the language matters because what there was agreement on, and people were scrambling to, propose more of it, which is, fencing, but they shied away from actually calling it a wall. Pat Buchanan in the 90s ran as a Republican, saying he wanted to build a wall.
In 92.
In 92, and I think again in 96. And Republicans shied away from him. They thought he was too hardcore, too extremist, so they kind of, treated him as some kind of fringe character. He said he wanted to build a wall and keep out drugs and migrants with the wall, and it was his sort of his term, and people ran from it. But now, several decades later, Trump has totally embraced it, and it's a new political era, post 9/11. Not a lot of memories of those early debates with Pat Buchanan, and he's been embraced in a lot of quarters for it. But you're right, the opposition also, no wall, right, has been a rallying cry, and so far he hasn't been able to build his big, beautiful wall, but as you put it, a lot of it's already built. It's just not called a wall. I mean, hundreds of miles, maybe over 600 miles of fencing currently exist along the border, and it's not as if Trump actually was proposing a 2,000-mile-long wall. I think his team immediately, or pretty soon after proposing it, acknowledged that a lot of the terrain wouldn't allow for a wall, and obviously you're not going to wall off the border ports of entry, which would wall off one of our most important trade partners. So yeah, the infrastructure is already partly in place. It's just that he's been the first person who's actually wants to call it a wall, and has done so proudly.
So going back to the late 80s, early 90s, let's start with the politics and then move to the policies of what those politics put in place in terms of escalating border security. Why and how did border security become the site of so much intense political drama in that moment?
Some of it is very local politics. I mean, it's a national issue, but in the early 90s, Governor Pete Wilson in California, he basically ran on a get tough on unauthorized immigration from Mexico, and turned out he struck a chord. California was in a recession. It was tough times right after the Cold War. The defense industry in Southern California was reeling, and Proposition 187 emerged out of California. And he cleverly showed footage that the Border Patrol had provided him of migrants dashing across the border, wide open, into traffic. It was just sort of, the images were just of a completely out of control, chaotic port of entry. And he played that up and partly won re-election on that. The federal government, in a sense, California and other local circumstances like in El Paso, they put it on the agenda for Washington, and then Washington responded by an influx of more fences, more manpower, more stadium lighting, and so on, to basically take back the debate over the border. I mean, it was almost an embarrassment for the federal government, and then they sort of cracked down and said, "Look what we're doing to secure the border."
And ironically, these images of people near San Diego running across the highway, that was actually a result of one of the early border enforcement measures.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because some of the first fencing that went up was the first 14 miles, the westernmost first 14 miles of the border, started to erect a fence. And so this was an area where migrants previously were fairly easily coming and going, including going, back and forth almost as sort of cross-border commuters, if you will. And once that fencing went up and they started, patrolling more, that actually drove migrants to dash across the port of entry itself, which was 14 miles in. And that's the footage that Pete Wilson used, was those migrants running right through the port of entry. So you're absolutely right. And that, if I'm not mistaken, that initial fencing was justified and used as an anti-drug effort rather than immigration control. I think it was funded by and justified as an anti-drug initiative. In fact, in the fencing itself, as I recall, were basically recycled, landing mats military landing mats from Vietnam and other military conflicts. And so it gave new meaning to the word recycling. It was kind of a Cold War recycling of old leftover Cold War stuff. And it wasn't a formidable fence, but it shifted the traffic and it had political consequences.
And this is something that happens again and again as border enforcement escalates again and again throughout the 90s and 2000s. You write is that it produces situations that then seem to call out for and justify yet more border enforcement.
There was a kind of self-reinforcing, built-in escalatory dynamic. You could almost call it a border version of NIMBY, not in my backyard. So, you push the migrant flow from one place to another, and then local communities in the new area where we're not accustomed to migrants crossing would be in an uproar. And then the federal government would put in some Border Patrol agents there, and then it would push it somewhere else. And so suddenly, it's not California, but it's Arizona, which is the, epicenter of the migrant traffic across the border. And, so although California border in a sense was, secured, the overall, migrant flows, during that period, if anything, were going up. And this shifting of migration from near major ports of entry into the Arizona desert had
enormous consequence for the migrants themselves.
Oh, sure. I mean, this is a, disaster and a tragedy in terms of literally pushing people into harsh and dangerous terrain where, if they were to continue doing what they're trying to do, which is enter the United States, someone would perish. And what's interesting is that it was called the INS, Immigration and Naturalization Service, which was then folded in the Department of Homeland Security shortly after 9/11. INS officials are on record as saying that they thought that terrain would be a deterrent, that they thought that migrants, that would be a natural fence, if you will. But it proved not to be the case, obviously. Instead, they braved the dangers, and importantly, they also relied more and more on professional migrant smugglers. So before crossing the border, you could self-smuggle, take yourself across, didn't have to hire anyone necessarily, more of a luxury than a necessity.
And people would, in between, let's say, downtown El Paso and Juarez, would talk about crossing by the river to get to work in El Paso, and then crossing back through the port of entry back into Mexico at night.
Think about it as unauthorized commuters.
Yeah.
It was that simple, that easy,
and well-established,
that visible, that well-established, tolerated for a very long time, frankly. And once the dynamic changed because of an effort to crack down, suddenly, migrant smugglers who'd been there for a long time, their business just boomed, and they could charge more, and the migrants were more dependent on them. So the migrant was not only at risk by the environment, meaning mountains and terrain and heat and cold, but also their lives were also put in the hands of professional smugglers in a way that wasn't true before.